This week in the Regency, we're following up on the story from the 4th week of January, in which Lord Kilworth and William Wellesley-Pole had a duel. Well, they tried to have a duel, but it never actually happened. Now, the reason for the duel is a bit complicated. Go watch that video. But it basically was about the fact that Lord Kilworth and Mr Wellesley-Pole are known, as the newspaper said, in the fashionable world, as rival candidates for the hand of the rich and amiable heiress, Miss Tilney-Long. That's Catherine Tilney-Long. I do feel that at this point, Jane Austen would slide a line in there about how astonishing it is, how often that rich heiresses are also known to be amiable. But in fact, Catherine did seem to be quite a nice person. She certainly cared for her family. She was the eldest of 3 girls. Her sisters Diana and Emma were younger, and she looked after them and cared quite a lot about them, clearly through her actions. For example, before the wedding, she settled quite a lot of money on them so that they would have a dowry or would have the chance to live without getting married, which is in fact what they did. Neither of them married. In fact, she settled £10,000 on each of her sisters and £3,000. This is per annum, £3,000 per annum to her mother. That's an extraordinary amount of money to give someone in those days. So she clearly cared about her family and didn't want them to be disadvantaged by the fact that she was the heiress. Now, it was reported that that they had got married in January, but they didn't. And so people were a bit like, why? Why didn't they get married? And the reason they thought they had got married was because William Wellesley-Pole had changed his name. So one of there were 2 things that Catherine did before the wedding. The first was to settle that money on her sisters and mother, and the other was to make him change his name. And so instead of Mr Wellesley-Pole, he had to become Mr Tilney-Long Wellesley-Pole. And so he, as a peer, he was in line to become the Earl of Mornington. As a member of a peerage family, he had to apply to the Prince Regent for permission to change his name. And he did that a couple of months before the wedding. And so he did actually change his name a couple of months. And that's why people thought that the wedding had already happened, but it hadn't. And when people found out that it hadn't, they started asking why. And at first they thought it was because he was waiting for his father to arrive from Ireland. So the Earl of Mornington is an Irish peerage. His father was a member of Parliament, as he was at that time, and they thought they were waiting for the father to arrive for the parliamentary term in February. And he arrived duly, and nothing happened. And so people thought, that's very odd. Why aren't they getting married? And the scuttlebutt was, and even though the newspaper says that they are satisfied it is untrue in every part, nonetheless, they found reason to print it. So, one wonders if the untrue on every part was just a way of getting out of defamation. A considerable sum of money advanced on the part of the lady, that is, from Catherine, for the purpose of preventing the disturbance of the domestic facility of the approaching union by supplying a female, not a lady, but not a woman. So a woman would be of the lower classes, a female slightly above that, but definitely not a lady, who was disposed to trouble it with the means of keeping up the carnival elsewhere. So they thought they were going to bribe this woman to go away. This money has been appropriated to a different purpose, and that the discovery of the misapplication had produced the result of stopping the union altogether. We are assured, however, that the marriage is still to go on. Now, I do feel that if I had been Catherine, and this had actually happened, I would really have thought twice about getting married to him. But it does get worse. Miss Tilney-Long and Mr William Pole do eventually get married. Here they are. This is Catherine and this is William. The long talked of matrimonial alliance between Mr Pole, now Wellesley, and Miss Tilney-Long took place on Saturday evening, as mentioned in our last. The parties met at Lord Montgomery's house. Now, he was probably her trustee, in Hampton Place, Piccadilly, at 5 o'clock. And about 6, accompanied by some of their nearest relatives, they went in Lady Catherine Long's coach, that would be her mum, to St James Church in Piccadilly. Now, remember Piccadilly, it becomes important later. The Marquis of Wellesley handed Miss Long out of the carriage and conducted her through the rector's house to the altar of Hymen. Hymen is the god in charge of marriages. They were present in the ceremony, which was performed by Dr. Glass, rector of Wanstead. Now, Wanstead was Catherine's home. This is what it looked like. It was one of the biggest houses owned by a commoner in Britain, and therefore probably in the world. And it becomes important later on. So present at the ceremony, Mr. Secretary Pole. Isn't that a great name? I love the fact that someone christened their child secretary. Lady Catherine Long, the mother, Miss Diana Long and Miss Emma Long, that's her sisters, the two latter were bridesmaids. The usual forms being gone through, the happy couple retired by a southern gate. Now, we're going to come back to the usual forms because it didn't go well. And they had a beautiful carriage waiting for them, and people were dressed, they had 2 postilions, a new chariot, a town chariot, presumably, and effectively we end up with a really expensive wedding. So it was so expensive, they had everything new. 2 postilions on their carriage when normally they only had 1, in beautiful livery with a coat of arms that joined together the crests of the 2 people involved. Well, what did she wear? A robe of real Brussels lace, point lace. That means it's a particular form of lace. This is what it would look like. This is a complex pattern. This was a single sprig pattern, which is harder to do. It was placed over white satin. The head was ornamented with a cottage bonnet of the same material, that is Brussels lace, with 2 ostrich feathers. She likewise wore a deep lace veil and a white satin pelisse trimmed with swan's down. Very pretty. Just to talk about lace for the moment, that the amount of lace in that outfit would have been the equivalent of a lifetime's work for one person. Obviously, many people worked on it. Lace was incredibly time-consuming and quite hard to do well, particularly Brussels lace. It was a very high-quality lace. It still is. And it would have been incredibly expensive. So let's find out how much. It's interesting, we know they probably put out like a press release of equivalent. The dress cost 700 guineas. The bonnet, 150 guineas. And the veil, 200 guineas. So we're up over 1,000 guineas for her outfit. To put that into perspective, a normal family of reasonable means, that would have kept 10 families for a year. But what about him? What did he wear? He wore a plain blue coat with yellow buttons, a white waistcoat, buff breeches, and white silk stockings. The lady looked very pretty, which is kind of sweet. The next thing I was quite surprised by is that they had bonbonieri, they had wedding favors. And they gave out 800 wedding favors. Obviously, that's more than the church probably could hold. So I imagine they sent them out to everybody that they invited, even those people in the country who couldn't come. And they were made of silver. The girls got acorns and the boys got a silver star. And then all of their servants also got them. So domestics and others, as they're referred to in the newspaper, they got one made of white satin ribbon with silver stars and silver balls. And what they say is sridge or fridge. I don't know what that is. I've been trying to find out. I've got no idea. The ladies' jewels consisted primarily of a brilliant necklace and earrings. The former, that is the necklace alone, cost 25,000 guineas. It's the equivalent of millions and millions of pounds now. So you would think this was a lovely wedding, lovely wedding. Yeah, no. He forgot the ring. And I'm not talking he forgot the ring like half an hour before the wedding. He forgot the ring and only realized it wasn't even like he forgot the ring at home. He left the ring at home. He forgot he had to have a ring. And he gets to the altar in this church that is packed with high society. And Dr. Glass, the vicar, asks him for the ring and he doesn't have one. Remember I said, remember they're on Piccadilly? Piccadilly has a lot of nice shops. And they ran out across the road to Brown's. And the guy brought a tray of rings to the altar, walks up the aisle and shows them a selection of rings. And they pick one and they go on with the wedding. So it's not a good omen, is it? First of all, he's paying off, exes. And then he's forgetting that he even needs a ring. And if I were Catherine, I would have been inclined to just walk away at that point. But alas, she did not. And unfortunately, it was an omen for the way their relationship was going to go. He turned out to be a drunkard and also a gambler. And it's pretty clear that he married her for her money. He was such a gambler that he managed to get through everything that had been allocated to him in the bridal settlements. So just to set it up, what happened was that she had trustees and they made sure he couldn't get his hand on the estate. So maybe they had an idea about what he was like. I don't know. He was clearly very personable, very charming, very vivacious. And, she was probably in love with him. He had fought a duel or was prepared to fight a duel on her behalf. Maybe that helped. I do feel she should have married Lord Kilworth, who at least had a sense of humour. But her trustees set it up so he had only a life interest in the estate. He couldn't sell anything and he couldn't touch her capital. But he still managed to get through everything and he would have had a very good allowance, and he got through all of it. He ended up in debtor's prison at one point. And Wanstead, beautiful Wanstead, her family home, the home she had grown up in, he sold. Not the house itself. This is after her death. He sold. He took the house apart, demolished it, and sold all the bits. He couldn't sell the house itself. He couldn't sell the land that it stood on, but he could do whatever he wanted with it while he was alive. And so he just literally took it apart and sold all the bits off to builders and, people who wanted a bit of Wanstead. And it just disappeared and is now a park in London, that area. he abandoned her. Now, admittedly, he had the threat of going to debtor's prison over his head, and he ran off to Europe so that he wouldn't go to prison. People used to get put into prison so that their friends would pay the debt. Basically, their friends and family would pay the debt. But clearly, Catherine had had enough of that and wasn't going to do it anymore. And so he ran off to Europe. He took up with somebody else there, whom he later married. 2 years after he left, Catherine died. And she had left her children to the guardianship of Diana and Emma, those sisters on whom she had settled money. So even without her money, they had enough to look after them, but they probably would have been paid more by the trustees. And then he tried to get custody, particularly of William, the elder, who, of course, once he was the guardian of William, he would have had access to all of William's money because Catherine's fortune devolved onto William. This is where the Duke of Wellington comes back in. By this time, he's Prime Minister, and he decides it's not at all a good idea. Remembering that these are relations of his, these children, are his great nephews and nieces. And he decides it's not a good idea at all for their father to have access to William's money. And he intervenes in Chancery Court to make sure that guardianship stays with the sisters. And so it does. He dies in Europe. He had got through everything that she owned that was available to him. And her annual income, which would have been available to him, was £80,000 per annum. Just unimaginable amount of money. And he managed to get through all of that. So I do feel that this obituary is reasonably accurate. A spendthrift, a profligate, and a gambler in his youth. He never seems to have stopped gambling. He became debauched in his manhood, redeemed by no single virtue, adorned by no single grace, his life gone out without even a flicker of repentance. In his last years, it was clear that, in fact, Wellington bribed him to leave. He dropped his Chancery Court case, the second one, and he went back to Europe, and the Duke of Wellington paid him £10 a week to stay there. And that's quite a lot of money in those days. 500 odd a year is quite a lot of money. So he was not a pauper by any means, but of course he was still a gambler and a profligate and a spendthrift. And so he didn't die with much. However, I want to end on a happy note because it's a pretty downer of a story. And the good thing is that the kids decided they didn't want to have anything to do with him as later on. And they dropped his name. They became Tilney-Long again. And Miss Tilney-Long makes her debut under Queen Victoria in a very nice dress and is subsequently happily married. So we do have an ending where the kids clearly just go, yeah, no, I don't want anything to do with you. In fact, I don't even want your name. And so, it's not too bad. He's happily married. She gets presented to Victoria. The family survives, but alas, Wanstead House is gone. So that was this week in the Regency. I'm Elizabeth Layden. I hope to see you next week in the Regency.